Hi everyone, this is Elaine Kuhn from the Kenton County Public Library. I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about stories from the stones. Historic Linden Grove Cemetery and Arboretum, which is located in Covington, Kentucky. It is a historical cemetery in the fact that it was one of the main burial places for early settlers of Covington, Kentucky. Just a brief history of the cemetery. It was consecrated officially in 1843, but before that it had been developed on land that was once part of the Western Baptist Theological Institute. It currently is the largest green space in Covington. And it's interesting, in the early days, this is from the Cincinnati Enquirer in 1842, they talked about what a beautiful tract of ground it was. It is around 23 acres, and they had started working on it, as you can see earlier than this, wanting to create it as a public cemetery. And they go on to describe how beautiful it is and that the avenues in the cemetery are wide enough for carriages and plenty of places to walk. Now, this cemetery was a necessity because the original cemetery in Covington was known as the Craig Street Burial Ground. This is a drawing of it from the 1877 Covington City Atlas. And in reality, in 1877, the burying ground was actually closed, and they had removed, later they found out, almost all of the bodies. The burying ground, the Craig Street Burial Ground, at the time it was created, and that actual date is still in dispute, but somewhere between 1815 and 1822, was at the time on the outskirts of Covington. Well, that didn't last very long. Of course, the city grew and expanded around the burial ground, and it suffered from the get-go, according to newspaper accounts, of neglect. People would let their animals go in and graze, and nobody was taking care of the stones. So finally, in 1872, the city decided to close it and started posting notices in the paper, to come and get your loved ones. Otherwise, they were going to be moved to another cemetery. Some of them went to Linden Grove, and we'll talk about one of them in just a little bit. Was the original entrance to Linden Grove Cemetery off of Holman Street. A little hard to get to. You can see there's an older caretaker's house there. It served its purpose for a lot of years, but recently, in the past few years, they were able to raise funds to create a new entry off of 13th Street. It's a beautiful entry, and it connects you with all the drives, so you can still drive around and walk around. There's now a parking lot right there, and it's a great place for them to hold events. One of the first people I wanted to talk about today was Letitia Robb, better known as Aunt Lou. Aunt Lou was born enslaved about 1838 near Lexington, Kentucky. So far, I haven't found a whole lot about her, but I do know that after emancipation, until the end of her life, she worked as a domestic for various families. She came to northern Kentucky around 1880, but she eventually worked for the artist Henry Farney. And Henry Farney was an artist that is famous for his Western scenes. There's some beautiful paintings of his in the Cincinnati Art Museum. If you've never seen them, I highly recommend a visit over there. Well, anyway, Henry, who was a bit of a bohemian and a man about town, was one of the I believe he was one of the founding members of the Cincinnati Art Club, and asked Aunt Lou if she wanted to come work over there. And I think after reading some of the articles about her time there, the best comparison almost would be a house mother for a fraternity. She did their cooking, housekeeping. She posed as a model for some of the artists. Even an author created a character based on her in one of his publications, which I just think is wonderful. And evidently, she did not tolerate silliness. And in a couple of articles I read, someone would try to pull something past her and she just wouldn't have it. Well, anyway, when she died in 1900, the art club went together and made sure she had a beautiful funeral. I mean, according to what I saw in the papers, Mr. Farney made sure she didn't want for anything at the end. And they even went so far as to create a tablet. They had one of their members, John C. Meyenberg, create a bronze tablet, and they put it there on her grave. But in 1931, as you can see, it was stolen. So what they did was they commissioned another one, and that's the one that's still there today that you saw just a few moments ago. So I just think that really shows, that one person who you might not think had that much influence, she had a great deal of influence in the lives of the members of the Cincinnati Art Club. The next person I'd like to talk about is Pliny Bliss. Pliny Bliss was born on the 16th of November, 1776 in Wilbraham, Massachusetts. He was the son of Oliver Bliss and Catherine Brewer Bliss. Pliny married Rhoda Jennison, daughter of Jonathan and Rhoda Ashley Jennison, in Walpole, New Hampshire on the 4th of June, 1812. The couple moved to Cincinnati in 1815, and by 1817, the couple moved to Newport, Kentucky, where Pliny built a Horseberry Boat, which was said to be the first of its kind on western waters. In 1818, the couple moved to Covington and resided in a house at the corner of Front and Kennedy Streets. Front Street is now Riverside Drive, but back then it was called Front Street. It was here that Pliny put his first ferry boat in operation between Cincinnati, Covington, and Newport. In 1820, Pliny and Daniel French of Hamilton County, Ohio, applied for a patent described as propelling boats horsepower. Pliny later built a steam ferry which was used up until the time the Roebling suspension bridge was completed. Research indicates that Pliny was the first captain of the steamer the General Pike, built in 1818, which ran between Maysville and Louisville. He is also noted as running a steam ferry boat across the Tennessee River at Florence, Alabama. Pliny Bliss's home in Covington must have been a respectable abode, as in July 1834, the Covington City Commission formed a committee to report as to the cost of erecting a fence around the public square, quote, similar to that before the door of Pliny Bliss, unquote. Pliny and Rhoda had 3 children. Their daughter Harriet Louisa Bliss, who was born in 1813, was married 3 times. First in 1836 to Bowling S. Leathers, who died, and Bowling died in Havana, Cuba in 1842. Harriet then married John Williams of Cincinnati in 1844. Mr. Williams died in 1847. Harriet's third husband was John Glenn, whom she married in 1848. Harriet died in Quincy, Illinois, of pneumonia in January of 1881. Pliny and Rhoda's other 2 children were the twins Oliver Hayes and Catherine Brewer Bliss. They were born the 7th of January 1821 in Covington. Oliver married Caroline Douglas. The couple also had twins, 2 girls, but unfortunately both children died in infancy. Oliver and his wife moved to California before 1860. Oliver out there had a reputation for growing local fruits and native plants. And for several years, Oliver served on the Los Angeles City Council. Oliver eventually moved to Santa Cruz, where he died the 20th of June, 1902. Catherine Bliss married John Brown, a native of Scotland, and had 3 children. Pliny Bliss lived with Catherine and her family in Covington according to the 1850 census. And I think he lived with them because Rhoda, his wife, died in Cincinnati in May of 1849 of cholera. Pliny died the 4th of March in 1854. This is just a close-up of their tombstone. You can see that both he and his wife are buried there. And then this is an advertisement. Remember, he talked about the horse-drawn ferry boat, or the horse ferry boat, rather. This is from the Western Spy newspaper from the 27th of June, 1818. And he talks about, with perfect safety, they can carry at least 2 wagons and teams and 10 or 15 horses and any reasonable number of people. And it talks about how they'll cross the river and they'll run through the day except a sufficient time for refreshment at breakfast and dinner. I mean, he wasn't going to compete fare-wise. He said it would be the same as in other boats. Okay, Samuel Easton was born in 1842 and died in 1854. So you can see right away he wasn't very old, and it is a very sad story. Samuel was the son of Shadford Easton, who was a leather goods merchant. They had a home in Covington, and one day when walking home from school, and this story was picked up on papers all across the United States, and it pretty well was the same story as what you see here, the murder of young Easton in Covington. He was on his way home from school, evidently, and with a group of other kids, and they were just goofing off. And they got up to a place in front of Henry Portman's grocery store. Now, there's been some discrepancy on what the man's last name was. Was it Portman or Fortman with an F? And I haven't found anything definitive yet on how it really should be. But basically what happened was young Easton had said something to a little German boy and was hopping around, and they were goofing, and the groceryman said, "What did you say?" And young Easton said, "I wasn't talking to you. I was talking to this boy." Well, then the groceryman called him a fool, and young Easton said, "You're the fool." And at that point, the groceryman, Mr. Portman, took off after the kids. Well, young Mr. Easton wasn't able to get away from him. He turned around and he hit him with a stick that he'd been playing with. And at that point, when Mr. Portman caught him, he threw him on the ground and basically stomped on him, which caused his death. The medical examiner said he had multiple skull fractures. He only lived through the evening. Mr. Portman was arrested and was put to trial and was sent to prison. Mr. Portman was 26 years old at the time and was a big guy. It said he was a full 6 feet in height and weighed over 200 pounds. He had a wife and 2 children, and they were in the process of building a house. But he went to prison for this. And there was some discussion that Mr. Eastman, when he found out what happened and who did it, that he was going to go over and exact vengeance on this guy, and that was not the case. And as a matter of fact, Mr. Easton posted in the paper, I had no such violent thoughts towards this man. But the interesting part is that on his stone, this is what it says: Samuel E., son of Shadford and Eliza Easton, born in Cincinnati, October 9th, 1842, murdered in Covington, Kentucky, October 6th, 1854, by Henry Fortman, while playfully returning from school. So in a way, that's how they got their vengeance, because it was put on his stone for everyone to see. As you can see, unfortunately, the stone is starting to erode. It's been there since 1854. And as a matter of fact, his parents' stones, they're supposed to be buried there, but their stones are gone. So Samuel's is still standing. It's just getting really hard to read. So I'm glad that people were able to transcribe what was on the stone. Poor little guy. Okay, the next person I'd like to talk about is Benjamin Franklin Howard, or better known as B.F. Howard. He was born in 1849 and died in Covington on the 2nd of May, 1918. His claim to fame is he is one of the founders of the African American Elks. He, along with a friend of his, decided that they needed a fraternal organization, and he was very interested in the Elks. So they looked around at the rules and rights and everything else, and organized the Improved Benevolent Protective Order of Elks of the World. The first one was formed in Cincinnati. He also would charter one. He sought to charter one in Kentucky, but it was turned down originally because of segregation and all of that. But he also went on to establish chapters in Virginia, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. It wasn't until the early 1900s that he was finally allowed to organize the Ira Lodge number 37 in Covington. He served as a grand exalted ruler until July of 1910. And he lived in different places in Covington. But eventually, like I said, he died in 1918. There's actually also a small park in Covington on 11th Street called the B.F. Howard Park to commemorate him. And what I think is really incredible is, well, at least up until COVID, whenever the African American Alps would have a conference in Cincinnati, that a group of them would come over and pay their respects at his memorial. This is the memorial that was dedicated in 2008, which is beautiful. This is his original tombstone. As you can see, it's in pretty rough shape. His wife, Mary, is also buried there, and she died in 1943. So that's B.F. Howard. Oops. Pardon me, I jumped ahead a slide, but I wanted to talk about Thomas Kennedy Jr. He was born in 1741 and died in 1821. He was born in Chester County, Pennsylvania. In 1767, he married a widow named Dina, and always looking for business. He sent his oldest son, Joseph, to scout out area in what is known now as the Point, near the confluence of the Licking and Ohio rivers. When he came back and reported on it, he acquired 150 acres on that spot. And not long after that, Thomas and his wife and 3 of their children came, and they started building a log cabin and commenced farming. About 1791, Thomas constructed this stone house. It's set down on the property now that's called George Rogers Clark Park in downtown Covington on the Licking Riverside neighborhood. It was the family lived in it long after he died in 1821, but as the oldest member got, too old and eventually died, nobody wanted to take care of it, and it was taken down. I feel fortunate that we have this picture of it. I like this. This is an advertisement not long after the city of Covington was formed in 1815. And as you can see, it says Covington, a new town, is laid out at the mouth of the Licking River on the farm lately owned by Mr. Thomas Kennedy. And it goes on to talk about how beautiful it is and how it's close to Cincinnati, and there's all kinds of industry and on and on. So they were trying to get people to buy property right there. Now, remember, we talked about the Craig Street burial ground. Well, when Mr. Kennedy died in 1821, that's where he was originally buried. And then when they announced that they were going to close the cemetery, and these are a couple of notices from the paper. This is one of the first. You are requested by order of the council to remove the body or bodies of your relatives from the Craig Street burial ground. Basically, come get your dead. The Kennedys had bought a lot by that point over in Linden Grove, and Mr. Kennedy and his family were all moved over there. I also included this little bit down here. This is from November of that same year in 1872, and it says, up to the present time, 1,789 bodies have been taken up at the old Craig Street burial ground. All of these, except about 250, were reinterred in Highland Cemetery. Highland Cemetery is in Fort Mitchell. It is supposed there are still about 100 or more bodies in the Craig Street Cemetery, and that's true. About 7 or 10 years after they moved all these bodies, some kids were playing in that area, and they came up on a skeleton. So they had missed someone, and they had to have them reinterred. But when you look at the records for Linden Grove Cemetery from 1872, you'll see people that it'll sometimes note, not always, but sometimes note that they were removed from Craig Street. And that's what happened to Mr. Kennedy. And we can't talk about Linden Grove without talking about Myrtle Mitchell. Poor little thing. She was born in 1895 and died in 1903. Her story is that she was terribly burned. I saw a couple of different versions of what happened, but the worst part is she was burned horribly and didn't die right away. She suffered. And then when she finally did die, and it talks about she died at home at 66 Bird Street. They even got her burial place wrong. But the saddest part is that nobody came. Her family was all suffering from a contagious disease, so there was nobody at her funeral. And we've always just felt like Myrtle needed to be remembered as much as possible. So we like to include her, and we always just kind of call her Myrtle Mays, or Maisie probably is how it was pronounced. So those are some of the people. I just wanted to talk about the stories you can always find in cemeteries. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact us. Here's our email, phone, and website information. I thank you for joining me today and hope to see you soon. Bye now.